Beautiful. We're all set. We're recording, and this is AI UX EMEA session, and we're talking about prototyping with AI, which is like a rapidly changing space. So, hey, Taylor. So I had kind of asked some discussion questions in the document, just kind of to show just kind of the variety of questions this topic brings up. And then also I have a link there to a Figma where you can see supporting resources, but also share any examples of prototyping, the results that you've gotten recently or tools that you have used or anything like that. So I also had shared some in there. And so I'm just kind of curious, just like off the bat, like what have you all used so far and like what has worked with prototyping?
I've only explored Bolt so far.
Mhm.
And I
Yeah.
feel like that has worked really well for me. I've enjoyed it. I have to jump into some of the other ones.
Uh-huh.
I haven't used it officially for anything GitLab related. It was more I was trying to see kind of what could come out of that. I think the UX is pretty good. Um,
Mhm.
Unrelated, I've also used Midjourney for icon creation, which
Ooh.
has been interesting as well. And like outside of work, I've used it for like logo inspiration and logo creation. So I found like Midjourney works well for like very, very visual things. And then
Yeah.
Bolt is good for like the actual prototyping aspect.
Okay. That's cool. Side note, Google just had a new release their new image model, and it's really good. I've not used it for icons, but for photos, I was kind of impressed because Google doesn't really, I wasn't saying that Google's are has my favorite models. So I was kind of surprised. Okay, that's super cool. And so you said you haven't, what did you use Bolt for before?
So I was using Bolt just because I saw, I think Torsten kind of put together a prototype for the Duo chat just to see what we could. So I was just seeing from some of my previous work if I could get something into Bolt that was a workable prototype. So I've done some stuff with like some of the Amazon Q comment stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So comment threads, how that could work and how that's interactive. Um, Also Duo Chat, if I could just get something similar to GitLab up on Bolt. So just experimenting with like how you actually have to prompt it to produce
Yeah.
similar enough. And it works pretty well from screenshots. So like throwing a screenshot in and then working around the screenshot has been helpful.
Yeah, that was also one of my takeaways was it seemed easier to just use a screenshot than to actually prompt it. Like
Yeah.
I thought as a designer it would be easy to say, hey, this is what I want, because it's generally what we do. It turns out that's even harder than I thought. And just a screenshot is actually quite nice of another product. And you're like, I like this thing here. Make it.
Yeah.
Yeah. What else? Other examples of people that have used hey Torian, nice to see you. And Pedro too. Uh Other examples of AI prototyping tools that you have experimented with, specifically kind of in the design journey.
I had like a precursor question just because I'm trying to get
Yeah.
caught up to speed. I'm sure we have some guidance somewhere on like the tools that we can use and what we could do with them. If someone could like link me to the handbook page or like a Slack message, that would be awesome for me to catch
Mhm.
up on that. While I
Yeah.
was on my parental leave, I was working on just like updating my portfolio site and use it as an excuse to play with V0. And like Emily's saying, I was just learning a lot about like trying to get good prompting into the chat. And I learned like over time, I'd get pretty frustrated as things got more complex and it would start like to hallucinate with what I wanted. And then it would start going off the rails and I have to continually just like nudge it back in. I found myself just always like leaving a template at the top to remind it. Like it kept wanting to build my site in React. I'm like, no, I wanted an HTML, JavaScript, CSS, vanilla style. Don't forget that. Just every time I kept having to remind it. So I feel like that's been part of the crux of me trying to learn is like how do I get better at
Yeah.
prompting it, and like you said, like giving it screenshots definitely helped it understand a little bit better, but then the nuances of things like animations were pretty tough to get more
Mm.
like specific of what I was envisioning and kind of had to just like live with what they could bring to the table at the time. Cause like I don't really know how to make you do what I want.
Yeah. Yeah, I do find that these tools aren't great on the details. They're great in broad strokes, but once we start getting down to details, it's like we're not quite there, right?
Yeah.
Taylor.
You might have also had trouble because V0 is owned by Vercel and they are very big in the Next React ecosystem. And I think they've designed V0 to work with React specifically and Next. So that's probably part of the annoyance.
Yeah, I
Ooh,
was definitely pushing it.
that's actually great detail though. This actually relates. I don't want to get too far off, but this is a loose conversation today, by the way. This is not super structured, but this relates to a conversation I had about the addition of new models into as we keep adding new models that get better and better, and the cognitive load on us to have to remember what models do what better. Right. So I was saying earlier, like I don't care for Google's models generally, like I don't use Gemini for Claude, for text-based. Google image had a really Google had a new image 3 model that came out, has really nice images. But now add the fact that like maybe if V0 is pushing more React, that's another thing I need to know about the product and the model in order to get the results I want out of it. And that stuff's not always visible. Like it might be in the documentation, but there's a learning curve, right? So how do we like as a user know that? I don't have the answer. But that's why it's great info, Taylor.
It does make me even just think back to challenges that we were seeing with Duo Chat, with people like not knowing how to get the information they want back out of it. It's like, well, you kind of need to understand the underlying model and what it's trained to do, but that's a bit obscure and possibly not even like something people care to pay attention to.
Yeah.
And so that's pretty hard because like some models are designed better for different tasks.
Yes.
And you just assume like, oh, I can just give it everything I want. And it's like, you could,
No.
you might not like your outcome.
Yeah.
So
My
We
my theory is I think there's going to be an explosion of niche tools again. So even in, for example, our space, it started with we're kind of in the phase of like the industry's maturing for the most part aside from AI, and customers are wanting to consolidate. So for example, like their security scanning used to be separate products, and you'd have a whole bunch of different proliferated products all over doing all these different things. And then now customers are saying, we want that brought into one product. And that's where GitLab really excels, is we can do it end to end. And I think AI is still in that phase of like, we don't know what it can do. And so you're going to end up with tools that are doing like little pieces really well. Like Midjourney does images really well, but it's really, really bad at other stuff. But it's also good enough that it's worth putting the extra effort in to be like, I'm going to take stuff from here and go to another one. Because I found with when I've been playing around with these tools, it's so hard to like stick with one tool. Cursor's the closest I've got but only because it allows me to like customize different models. And like, for example, I can set rules. And so I can say only use HTML or don't use React or use Tailwind, whatever it is. And I can set that rule and it just applies everywhere. I can customize, like I can use DeepSeek for like chatting. I'll do often, and like breaking down a problem because it has really good reasoning. And then I can take that and put it into their composer, which is the agent, and Claude's better at doing the actual coding. So I sometimes like even use like ChatGPT or Claude or these other desktop apps to like work through a problem. They'll be like, oh, I like this, and I'll take it and paste it into something else. So that's kind of my opinion, is I think it's just going to continue getting worse for a little while until it consolidates again. I think it's just kind of the natural cycle of how things go.
Yeah, even in your just description there, I just heard you walk through your workflow and talk about, I use this model for this, I use this model for this, I use this model for this, like that deep knowledge of the capabilities, like actually enhances your workflow, right?
Yeah, but for me, it's just all trial and error. So I think some
Yeah.
people are just unwilling to be willing to try it or not interested. And those ones, I guess, will probably have a not as optimized workflow, but they just want something that they can get good enough, I think, until maybe they get to the point where they're like, okay, I can understand. And that's where I think Cursor does such a great job, because it's like it gives me defaults. I don't have to set rules. I don't have to customize my model. I don't have to do any of these things to use it. I can just start using it right away. So I really think Cursor is doing a great job because I mean, I think people also thought that like they made fun of like the chat GPT wrappers.
Mhm.
And it's kind of looking like the wrappers are actually where some of the value is, because the models are a little bit more replaceable. But at the same time, I do think people get used to models, how they respond, how they have their own like personalities. So I think it's
Yeah.
these tools that can just give you a smart default, and then but then also let you customize it. I think those are going to generally do well.
There's a design opportunity there for the products to give their models personalities, so users understand them better. Like I could see that happening, to make it a little more, I think for developers or people that are used to working on technical projects, you're comfortable with the idea of a model and model behavior, but maybe for someone who's not in that space, like, what does it mean that a model behaves differently? What is a model, right? Some people don't know what models are, and so there's an opportunity there almost to define that for the user and make it more approachable, maybe a creative space. Okay. Let's see, I'm looking down kind of some of the comments here. Pedro, you had said that for your purposes, and you have very specific purposes that you mentioned here, that you want to create ephemeral design artifacts, which you had actually showed in a previous session. You want to say more about that?
Yeah, I then expand a little bit more below under point E, because I was just focused in point B, I was just focused on talking about the tools.
Yeah,
Which tools, not how I'm using it.
yeah.
But for me, I've had more success with Claude because it's, compared to, let's just say, basic, AI design or prototyping tools, like some of the Figma, plugins, they just generate, options visually for you based on what you input, and they may or may not, match what your style, right, of like the using the components of your design system and your brand, whatever. And it's just there, like it's just generating things, but there's no context, like there's no explanation, there's no rationale, and you have to do a lot of the work of understanding the pros and cons of all of the options that it's generating. So it's a little bit like, you ask someone else to come up with concepts and they just throw the, PNGs at you, and you now have to do all of that work of figuring that out. And it doesn't have any context. So for me, in that end, like Claude strikes a good balance because it not only provides, options that work, those very basic prototypes, but it gives you, the rationale, and you can follow up to kind of critique, those designs and, dig more into them. And at the same time, when I was saying like ephemeral artifacts, and at least in our context here at GitLab, I don't think we need to build, design prototypes that will be used like in the midterm, right? It's just something to communicate an idea, maybe, and then you just throw it away, right? Then that's why it's ephemeral. I don't see that, being useful. Or it could be useful, but I think for most use cases, I don't see the value of using at GitLab things like Bolt or Builder or Replit or things like that. Because by that point, I think when you get to that, end, you might already be considering of actually moving into development if you need that level of fidelity and even like deploying something to share with others. So for me, it's just, as a brainstorming tool to see those prototypes, maybe come up with, something very basic just to share an idea on one day, and then the second day it's been thrown away and we're continuing to work in Figma or moved to code.
Yeah, so two parts on that. I wanted to ask, because you were talking about the context, right? What you're generating in Claude has no context of like your design systems and patterns and stuff like that. Would that change? Let's say Figma had a tool where you could generate your prototypes within our existing design system. Would that change how you use prototypes?
Yeah, 100%. I think it's a little bit like what what Taylor was saying about Cursor. And in Cursor, when you're, instead of like thinking through design ideas, you're thinking through code ideas, right? And you're, in that case, you're actually doing the work, but you can ask questions, AI, when it generates, changes for you in Cursor or another IDE tool. It also gives you an explanation of what it is doing and why it's doing in a certain way. You can feed it with context from documentation, use this API documentation, or even like for our purposes at GitLab, use this development documentation that we have on the docs site to build code and also write our UI text or even write documentation in the style and language of GitLab. So for me, I would like to see more of that in Figma, for example, where you can actually pair design with AI. I think just having AI as just generating things with no rationale. I think you can also get a lot of that, but just by just going like to Dribble or to other sites that just have images and inspiration. That is good, but I think we want more than that.
Yeah, you bring up another part too about like where we're using this prototype at, and that's kind of like the question I have for others. Where do you see prototyping adding the most value? AI prototyping, I should say. Is it in the beginning where we're just doing brainstormings, kind of to your point, Pedro, where it's like ephemeral, right? I'm going to show it, I'm going to communicate my idea, and then we're moving on. Or do we see it further down the path? Like maybe I'm able to generate, maybe the tools get good enough where I'm able to generate a working prototype in code. I can get closer to the code than just doing it manually, right? If we one of the things I'm thinking about is if we combine tools, right? So Cursor can't do everything, Figma can't do everything, but kind of to Taylor's point, we start combining these tools in our workflow, right? Then would prototyping change?
Yeah, I think it will be at different moments. You're going to need those tools. But yeah, I'll stop talking so that others can chime in.
Well, don't stop talking. Like everything you're saying is good stuff. So like keep it going. Now I was gonna say I almost think that we may see a shift on the company and how they regulate our workflows once they kind of catch on to the fact that we're using multiple models to create prototypes or create, workable instruments. And I think that's where we're going to see, well, how we're going to continue to progress with like this technology. Because I mean, at the end of the day, who's to say that there's a group of product managers having the same conversation about, well, technically we can design code and we're having the same conversation. Well, technically, we can like create specs and create requirements and create documentation, and we can create code as designers. So I feel like based on the stance that the company may take when it comes to what they want us to use and how they're going to like regulate the use of these applications is going to determine the roles that we have as a workforce and how we work together as a triad versus just like a creative cohesion, because like we're tearing down the walls of like specialization. So now it's a matter of just knowing what you want to do and being able to have the tools to do it. Right.
I think there's like, yeah, that component there that you just said, tearing down the walls of specialization. This goes to kind of the broader picture of the blurring of our functions and what we can do because of what these tools enable us to do, right? That's a good point. So technically we're only allowed to use Claude, right? That's our tool, and obviously Duo, which is great. I experimented with a bunch of these other tools using a personal account, just to see kind of what the outputs were. And one of the things that was not surprising, but still surprising to see from a visual perspective was just how different my outputs were. I have an example in the Figma. I'm going to share the Figma here, but it is truly a big difference. So I started in Claude, and basically what I'm trying to build is a prompt engineering tool that allows me to compare and contrast an old prompt with a new prompt, see my evaluation metrics, and lets me integrate data either through APIs or through static synthetic data. There are comparable tools out there on the market, but we don't have necessary access to them. We can use Langsmith, but Langsmith is really built for developers, not so much for designers. And so I was trying to give Claude some, get it to where I wanted it to be in Claude so I could communicate this idea to the developers, right? To say like, this is what I'm looking for. I didn't quite get there. I got close, but right, if we think about this as I'm trying to communicate my idea, right? Working in AI is so abstract sometimes that it can be hard when you're talking about new tools to support AI workflows. It can be hard to get everyone to align. So I find this very useful. And I'm not terribly great in Figma. So it takes me a long time. So I tried Lovable, got completely different responses, as you can see from Claude. I tried Bolt, which was kind of a fail. I did not like Bolt for my purposes, but again, this is my purposes, right? I liked their variable. And I should say too, one of the things here, I went from having it, I'm wanting the interactive piece. I want to see how can I add stuff? What can I do with it, right? That's the value in here. And then, so those were kind of just a high level. And then I went over to UX Pilot and just generated the Figma designs. And you can see that, I think it's linked in the document, but you can go see the Figma designs that UX Pilot generated. And this was from a single prompt. It gave me 2 of them. And I'd be curious for those of you that are Figma experts or just Figma users regularly, like how it looks from your point of view. And so then I realized that from there, I wasn't getting great outputs on some of these tools like Lovable. Like I really liked that I could get the process of getting here was super easy. This was 1 prompt, right? So whereas this one took me a lot more, Claude took me more. So I went back and added that screenshot from Lovable, from XPilot UI to sorry, where I'm at, the Lovable, and got this as an interactive prototype that I could use and share with people. And I did that in like less than 10 minutes. And I was like, okay, so, I mean, it took me more than 10 minutes to figure out what tool to use. I should say that. It took me a couple hours to figure out what tool to use to experiment, but it was a really interesting process of trying to figure out, okay, I'm a user who's trying to figure out what design tool to use. Let's assume my organization lets me use all these tools. Which one do I use for the task? All right. And I will say, even in this prototype, one thing that's funny is there's no button on here for me to generate a result. So that was a fun finding, and it was actually the problem started in my screenshot from the Figma design. So there was no button in here. I didn't check to have a button that actually like lets me run my prompts. So a bit of a fail there, but it's interesting the difference both in the tool output. This was a UI, I want to say Wizard, Wizard.
Weird Zerd.
Wizard. It's super weird. This was the output based on the same prompt, and then you add a screenshot and it was this. So it's just like all this to say is like the results are all over the place, which we see in general with text, right? See a lot of variation between models. So then this kind of becomes this question then, like, well, if I am using these tools for prototyping, what's the best tool? And as an organization, how do you define what tool? Like if we were all the design teams were like, we want prototyping tools for whatever reason beyond Claude, how do we know which one to choose?
Yeah, I think for your specific use case here, I think maybe what you want is not so much the as far as I understood what you meant, what you're primarily looking for is not so much the visual, like the UI itself, but it's more what you can do with it. Like what is the
Yeah.
information that is visible?
Yeah.
What are the actions? And so of course it matters how the layout, is done, and where the specific actions are and information, but maybe for you, the most important thing here was just to convey this idea of this tool that you need, this prompt, engineering tool, so that maybe someone else would build it, right? Or would integrate it with our existing tooling, right?
Yeah, exactly. And it needed, for my purposes, I needed clickability. I needed to be able to take that design and share it with somebody else, whereas I can't do that with Claude, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, again, look at that. It comes back to the use case,
Yeah.
right? What
exactly.
are my needs as the user?
Yeah, I
defines the
think
tool.
in that regard, I think what you did, with some of the other like Lovable, for example, where you could share it immediately with someone, that might be a better way to solve that conversation compared to if you had to build that within GitLab, or if you just wanted to visualize the concept, and the most important part was the design concept and not so much the problem to solve. In that case, maybe you would go directly to Figma and maybe use those tools to generate UI in Figma. So yeah, I
Different
think the
use cases for
starting point,
prototyping.
what you were saying, like the starting point, like at what moment of the development flow are we? And what is the goal, what we're aiming for? So a little bit like, how do you decide between like low fidelity and high fidelity, this is an oversimplification, but I think it's that.
I was going to add that I think this like prototyping opportunity would lead to more like throwaway code, like Pedro was saying, like with the ephemeral concepts. And just like you're demonstrating, like you can come up with a lot of ideas really quick. So I think what it gives designers or even PMs or whoever is looking into different concepts is they can go wide on ideas probably faster than they could just manually building it in Figma. Where it will start to kind of fall apart is like once you've kind of like landed on like a direction more or less, when you start to get into the specifics of like how are we going to make this and how are we going to get it to work with our business logic, that's kind of where you'll probably just spend more time fighting an AI model rather than just like building it and filling in the details. So using your example, that line about like adding variables into the prompt, that might be something we want to add in a milestone. Trying to get it to do all the things that GitLab can or cannot do would probably be just more annoying. But pitching the concept of building a prompt tool, it can help communicate that idea faster than probably someone just stitching everything together in Figma. And so different tools for different things, and they're going to come and go. I probably won't hold any of them too closely as like, and telling this is the best. And there'll probably come a time where the weight that we put into a tool becomes just so great that we're like, this is what we want everybody to use. At some point, we said no more Sketch, Figma, the business value prop is clear for us. That may or may not happen with these specific AI tools, or it may become like a multiple of them, but there will always be opinions on which is better. If you look back on all of our development practices and what tools people like and languages, like it's always going to flip flop. Someone says Vue, someone says React, someone wants to use a JetBrains IDE, someone says Visual Studio is just fine. No one's going to completely agree, but I think as long as we are given the opportunity to use tools at our job, we'll just find a way to make them practical.
Jeremy, you joined. How are you using AI prototyping?
I've been using Claude I'll rough up something quick in Figma and send Claude a screenshot. And depending on how I want the output to be, whether it's like I want literal code, how would I do this in JavaScript, or hey, I've got these two components in GitLab UI, and I'm seeing this in the product that doesn't use either of those, and it doesn't match. How could I use these two components to make this? And then, okay, let's see if it'll give me some workable Vue code or something. So that's the extent of what I've been doing. I can also use it on the other side to give feedback about an experience or whatnot that might change how I might do something locally. So it's kind of a different approach where I might mock up something in Figma and say, okay, Claude, like, is this hierarchy clear, or how are you interpreting this information? And then so it can also inform how I might prototype something in Figma if I was to do that too. So I can use it both ways, where it doesn't have to just be the creator of it. It can also help kind of with guidance.
I like
Really
that
good
switching back and
example.
forth. Yeah.
Yeah, really good.
Yeah. What about then, thinking about how we're using prototyping, we've talked, kind of as like the initial design, communicating interaction, things like that. How do you think that will change our workflows if we're all starting to use them? And have you seen an example of it changing your workflow? Like already, either you or someone else that maybe not in the design role might be coming up with a prototype. What do you think? Has anyone seen that?
It hasn't changed my workflow yet, just because the tooling that we can use just isn't integrated with Figma
Mhm.
well enough. I think the big one for me is the ability to share an environment where I've created these things.
Mm.
For example, like GitLab pages or a remote development environment, like that Figma allows you to do that. All these new tools that are popping up allows you to share a link. Without that, it's very hard to get feedback. So to me, that's one of the big kind of limiters. And then the other one would be, I think if I did adopt something like this, my workflow would definitely switch to doing my initial pass would be super low fidelity. Like static
Mm.
mockups, I wouldn't put much effort into. It would be more general layouts, positioning idea, helping me find the idea. And then I would probably like do a first pass of kind of like vibe coding, which is so like I've used Cursor for some side projects, and I find I code in a completely different way where it's just feels more like I'm working in Figma where I'm just trying things out. And I'm not even necessarily checking the code before I accept it. I'm just, let's see what this work, how what this looks like. Does it work? And I'm just doing really fast iteration loops like that. And I could see that being how I would maybe design with AI as like a co-designer, co-programmer,
Mhm.
until I get something that I like. And I think that would work really well if we also could have like the pajamas component library and a set of like style guide and rules that is just standardized for the whole team. Because then those responses are going to be more likely to fit within a sort of a structure that I can understand. And I can just quickly kind of like vibe code with it, get something that I like, gather feedback, and then from there I can either refine it or I can throw it away and start something new. But then ideally at the end, I would have a prototype too that I could just like quickly user test, and it's all prototyped out. There's interactions. I can hopefully identify patterns where it's like, oh, this feels strange with a hover. Just these things that would have taken me a long time in Figma to manually prototype and then get feedback better. And I think sure it'd be great if it's using our component library and it's potentially close to production code, but in some ways I think it's almost better if it's not, because then when it gets to engineering, engineering can't just like they're like, okay, this is just throwaway. This is just an advanced prototype. So but for me, without shareable, the ability to have some sort of a shareable collaborative link, I don't see how I could really make that much use of it because it's just kind of stuck in my like local environment.
Jeremy, that's great details. Thanks, Taylor.
Yeah, I think it's just not there yet. Like I think the ideas are there, but I haven't seen like a full-fledged workflow. So like I know that Figma, for example, is going to create the ability to plug in your own design system and have the AI generate layouts like you can do today with just kind of the concepts, right? But it's pulling from other sources, so it's not going to look like GitLab. But if we were able to pull and say, hey, I want to create, this dashboard and I want to use these components, we could generate that. I think that that would be something that would be like a good use of it. But then you're still at an artifact. You're still, to Taylor's point, something that could be throwaway or not. And so, but then I think there's the opportunity to also use it for QA to say, okay, I've designed this. Is it using the system correctly? Are there ways I could do this better? Are there ways I could adjust variance to adjust the hierarchy and be, work better with like localizability or other things about it? And then from there, like there's Code Connect, another, Figma feature. Like, okay, I've got these components and it's tied to our view assets. Can you now do something to comprise to actually spit out like a workable thing that I could post? I think it's the ability to get closer from like accurate design to code, which is really what's going to help us. If it's just creating more artifacts, I'm not really interested in that. Like we can create artifacts all day long. So I think the really interesting piece is how can I get it more accurately to code accurately? And I just haven't
Yeah.
seen anything that there's too many gaps in those steps today to make it uh, accurate or viable yet.
Once again, we're talking about like, it's interesting to see like the evolution of generative AI over the last 2 years from going from, look, this tool can do this fancy thing, to, look, I need all these tools to fit together into a workflow. So I'm not just jumping from tool to tool to tool to tool, right? And we're starting to kind of see platforms start to realize that, both legacy platforms and new platforms that come out. Cursor's a great example, platform, whatever we want to call it, IDE. Being able to really bring all of these pieces together, the models, the capabilities, the ability to connect your data, because the differentiator is model plus data. It's the data, right, that gets us the outputs that we want. I see in the chat, Jeremy, AI ops, yes. Pedro, your hand's up.
Yeah, I was talking with Pini this morning about this, and well, not necessarily for design, but just the different approaches that we're seeing today with the AI tools like Bolt and Lovable and V0, which is just like usually like more ad hoc. You can definitely build, good things with it, like things that even get to a point of polish and sophistication that you can actually make money out of whatever you build. Um, but those to me are more like ad hoc, simple, smaller things that once you get to a point of maturity or scale, that you now need to keep that going, right? And you need to scale it up more. You need to maintain its security, you make sure it's compliant. I think you need a different kind of tool, in the same way that we have Figma, and then Figma decided, oh, like for whiteboarding, people are trying to use Figma for whiteboarding, but it's not working well. We need to build a separate tool that is just geared towards that kind of environment. Or even, before Figma, people were using Balsamic a lot for wireframing, because it was just really well designed for that specific situation. I do see Figma potentially filling that gap from, since the more design phase into the code, of having the ability to maintain that consistency and coherence and those links across the whole software development lifecycle. As Jeremy was saying, I think that is the most valuable piece. I would also like to see in reverse, so not only going from Figma all the way into code, but also maybe the opposite. So maybe you start into code and you have the ability to reverse engineer or reverse design that into Figma, so that you can then continue to polish it visually and then bring it back into the code, because I think you're going to need that level of fluidity. But this is just to say that I think Figma will probably fill in the gap of that more enterprise, over time, scalable way of working. But we're always going to need smaller, more simple ways to just get ideas out and test them, and then throw them away, maybe, or then promote them to Figma, for example, or another tool that is more comprehensive. So I think in the same way that I don't know, you need a pencil just to get an idea and sketch something out. But if you then want to do a technical drawing, you're not going to use a pencil, or you're not just going to use a pencil. You're going to have a whole toolbox of things to, make the technical drawings, or even, go to AutoCAD or another tool to design those and communicate those in higher fidelity. So, yeah.
Does it change thank you, I like this thinking too on the enterprise piece, right? Where it's like Figma obviously has that market and that capability to really design for enterprise, not just for your individual users, right? Building things to sell. And that is a big differentiator. I'm curious, with regards to the AI prompting tools, what happens if someone comes to you, let's say like a PM or a dev, with a high fidelity mockup or prototype? Does that change the workflow? Does that change the way designers then interact with it? Or how do you approach that? Because that's essentially what could happen. It could be a PM, it can be a dev, it could be the CEO. Granted, the CEO you're going to listen to, because obviously there's a CEO. Okay, bad example. But if we just take the idea here that anyone can come in with a quality prototype to communicate their idea, what does that do to the role of the design, to the designer and the design process, Kaylin?
I mean, I think in some ways it can be great if they're trying to articulate an idea that otherwise it would take a lot longer to sort of like get that through, especially when people are doing the like bring me a rock of designs where you keep showing them things and they're like, that's not it, type of thing. But I think that it can be incredibly dangerous and problematic because it's like everybody's focusing on this part of it when it's like the hard stuff and important stuff is here. And so it's like there's real danger in something looking too done, especially if it doesn't like really think through. Like I've peppered a bunch of different comments under sort of different questions, but it's like, okay, the ethics of it. Like if PM like shows it to somebody and is like, we're gonna make a ton of money doing this. Like normally some of those ethics questions, like UX are the ones that tend to push the most on like, not can we do it, but should we do it? And that it's like, it sort of could like take the fight to a very different place, especially if it's like, but it looks done, like look, it works, like let's just test it. And it's like, okay, yeah, there are all kinds of things that like are horrible ideas that like, yeah, will increase a metric for a period of time, but are actually like long-term really damaging to your product and your brand. So it's like my husband worked at ClassPass forever, which has like the most infamous terrible cancel flow. And like he hated it and like all these other people hated it. And it's like, it is literally long-term going to damage their business, but they refuse to do it because they will not take the short-term hit that it will show in their revenue model for like letting people cancel in an ethical manner. So it's like, I do think that like the great news is if we can end up spending like less time fighting with high fidelity prototypes to either like truly get an idea across or to have something that like is a testable environment that we can like get people to go through, if we're actually allowed to spend that time in the important questions of like what problem are we actually solving in collaboration with product, how are we going about it, is it the right way to do it, like talking to engineering about that type of stuff, great. If not, I won't say on camera my feels on that one, like on a recorded meeting.
Implied.
It involves expletives.
Yeah, it does raise the question though, because I like how you phrase that about all of this that hasn't, like our work isn't just the final output, right? It's all of it that comes before, the discussions, the thinking, our design knowledge, our experience, our design systems. We're bringing all of that into the output, not to mention the user research, the conversations we've had with, multiple stakeholders, right? That's all going into this research. And in some ways, you could see how that is skipped with just a prompt, right? Even me as the designer, I didn't think too hard about it. I was just like, let's put in a prompt and see what happens, right? And so I could see, because the promise of these tools is efficiency, right? That is the number one promise of these tools. You could start to see where there might be some tension around what we've already created, the design. Let's just, as you kind of said, let's just test it. Or I think someone else said, let's just test it, right? And so how do you create an environment and how do you structure teams so that way if we are using these tools, we build in those conversations, because it really is much more of a collaborative approach than design makes something, hands it to dev, right? So what does that look like to design those teams? Does anyone, you're smiling over there, Austin, tell me.
Yeah, I mean, we already have to live this out at GitLab, and not through AI tooling, but anyone opens a merge request, that code is ready there to be merged. And almost everybody on this call I've seen have to say no at a merge request. And it goes back to our values as a company and the handbook guidance that we have around our processes, not necessarily to like block things, but to challenge them in the way that makes sense. And so that same sort of logic would apply to just throwing out a pretty prototype, or even just code that'd be ready to merge. Like we still have to apply all of the same structures that we want to make sure that we're putting in the right stuff. What I've seen over time is it's way more expensive to remove it than it is to put it in. So if we just are very thoughtful about what we put in, then we can feel more confident about it. And if we can get to those confident ideas faster, that is great. But it just brings just another avenue of ways to critique ideas and figure them out. But I think luckily as a company, we've had to face that challenge of what happens if company ABC makes a merge request that goes kind of against what we want the feature direction to be for the plan stage. It just is something that we've had to already kind of work through. It just
Yeah.
looks different depending on which role you're in and who we kind of need to add the defense or the justification. Sometimes
Yeah.
PMs are bringing in that why, even if UX disagrees with it, we can maybe see the value prop, or maybe engineering's pushing back on a UX concept because it's too costly to run on our infrastructure, and we can't just afford those queries, and we have to find a workaround. And so we'll just have to see how that evolves with these new tools. But it goes back to just
Yeah.
what's the company doing? What's our values? What are our processes? And we're finding that, so we have a culture that supports it.
Yeah, I'm wondering too, like we do have that built-in process with the MR, right? Like to be able to say no and talk it out there. I'm wondering before we get to that point. So let's say, you know, someone's got an idea, it's not designed, they've developed a prototype. Do you think there's do you think there's a possibility that maybe because we have these tools, it might open up the conversation more? Because anyone can prototype. Does it, maybe a better question is, does it facilitate a conversation better because we have a quick prototype that we all maybe aren't as invested in, right? If it's ephemeral, right? Can it be used for that earlier in the process so we don't make it to merge request and have to say no? I mean, not every situation, but in general.
I think the key part of there is earlier in the process. So I think if there was like there's these stages where like it's appropriate to have this at this point, and then we're going to go through these other steps to determine what to do with that artifact and that prototype. I think then it could work. Oftentimes I feel like the way we prototype today is like in an MR, like this is the prototype, this is the final suggestion. So I think if it was clear that like, this is further upstream, I think it could work. And then we'd be more open to some of that dialogue and conversation about what to do next and where did the information come from that created this. Let's try another version. Let's do this. I think that, but yeah, the key to me was that earlier in the process part.
Yeah. Almost
Yeah,
like a catalyst. Yeah, go ahead.
I think the collaboration aspect to me is, I think, the part that keeps getting missed in AI tooling. That's what makes Figma so great, is like everyone can just get a link, jump in, start making comments. You can give them edit access. Um, and I think the same thing is with these ideas. Hopefully we can spin up ideas faster for more people. It's more democratized, but we just have to probably then adjust our approach to just be, now we have more of a review process, or our role changes to being more explaining and going through problem solving of like, does this meet our criteria? And I think we already, like Austin mentioned, have this problem already. Like we, in our strategy for the next year, the CEO was mentioning like, we want to hold back features until they're ready. We're going to use feature flags. We're going to deliver more quality rather than rushing things out. So we're already facing this problem. I think that this in many ways would help because hopefully we can flesh through ideas faster. But I think a lot of it just comes down to, if there's not that collaborative aspect, things will end up in a merge request. We might not even see it. Like that whole process there, I think becomes much more important.
Yeah. You also mentioned how it might change our role. And I'm kind of curious about that. I know Kaylin had, we had a question on here on the benefits of AI prototyping, and you had said, maybe if we're not pushing as many pixels to perfect Figma prototypes, we can put more time and energy into flows and strategy. Right? Does that seem like, what do y'all think of that? Like, that's a great example of how it might change our workflows, right? How we do our job. Other examples of that you can think of?
Personally, I think the roles of product managers and product designers are going to change a lot myself. I think that you see design engineers, you see product managers who are doing design. I think the lines start to get really blurry, and I think probably eventually something has to change. I don't know exactly what it is, but they seem to like there's going to be a lot of merging and a lot of more expectations, I think, from everyone in these roles to either deliver code or become more in the business side. I think that Torian just said there. Yeah, I just see the lines blurring.
Plus one, definitely. Caitlin?
Yeah, I've been thinking a lot about that one in the ways that they specifically blur. Because it's like I was a developer, and then I was a product manager, and then I'm like went back to design, and now I'm a design manager. Like I've done all of the things in the software development life cycle, I guess, except QA and formally content design. But we have this constant pressure to the left. All of this stuff, it's like you have your software development lifecycle. Like let's say you're following like vaguely agile processes. Like everything puts pressure to the left here of like where it's like that's where like product and design live. And then it's been like, you know, like engineering, like deployment, all of these different things. Cause it's like we're automating so much of this portion. And that it's like right now, technically AI is actually making like code worse because it's creating tech debt at a higher rate. Like if you look at DORA metrics, you look a lot at the actual things, like it's not. But let's say it magically does, and it like speeds up all of this portion, then that means you have corporations like looking for value and like figuring out what to ship faster. So that means that that's good, that there's twice as many of us if you have PMs and designers of what's actually happening there. But like I imagine our roles are going to fuse within that space a lot, depending. Yeah, but I think we're not there yet, but I think like 2 years from now, like shit's gonna get real crazy.
It's interesting. There's a piece there that reminded me of Microsoft just came out with a report on kind of the impact on generative AI on skill sets, and they talked about the atrophy of skills. But in this kind of report, they also go into people whose jobs shift to observability. They called it observability. So the idea of you are looking at the outputs of generative AI output instead of creating the outputs. Now generative AI creates the outputs, and you're looking at the outputs and editing them.
But you're actually reducing people's ability to edit the outputs because
Correct.
in the process of taking away all of their decision and judgments along the way, you've atrophied that part of their brain and literally reduced their ability to do that effectively.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's interesting when we think about like the role of blurring our functions, and then we combine that. And then I was also, maybe it's not so much like there's the part where we're losing the skill, but there's also the piece of, okay, well, what if the job does become looking at the outputs to ensure that they're correct? Do we have joy in that? Like, is that what brings us joy in design, you know? So it's interesting to look at it from like the evolution. We talk a lot about like, will this change? Will this replace designers? Will it not? Will it replace software developers? Will it not? Right? But the nuance in there is so much more interesting, kind of to the point, Taylor, about, you know, the lines are blurring, it's going to shift. And then also, what could it shift into? I think that's kind of the open question too. There's 2 more questions left. I want to just say, like, I want to start with just what are the limitations, because we always talk about the benefits. So I'd really like to see from your perspective, what are the limitations of these tools? We talked a little bit about, right, they can't quite get us there, that not every tool does everything that we need, right? Figma doesn't have it all. What else is on your mind here? Austin, you mentioned the learning curve.
Yeah, I think people oversimplify how easy it is to use some of these to the degree you want to use them. And then beyond that, because of our different specialties, we lack the knowledge of the other specialties. So we may lack the depth of knowledge of the infrastructure from engineering, or we may lack the business understanding from the direction of PMs, and vice versa goes for them too. So there's still like a need for the roles of the people, just how we use them will probably be based off of how far we can take them with our own personal limitations. And yeah, if someone finds joy in making very specific mockups, then like that may have to change in different ways.
Yeah. Caitlin, you're somewhere. Oh, go ahead.
Oh, I
Okay.
also wanted to say another limitation is just we'll have to change the way we adapt to new tools, because I think the past like 10 years of design, you're stuck with like the same tools for years. And I think going forward, we're going to just have to adjust our workflows to relearn new tools a lot quicker, because I feel like the space is like adapting a lot faster than it ever has before. So I think that's something we'll probably have to take into consideration as like we move through this as designers.
Does that excite you? Or like, Yeah.
I think it's like a bit of both. I think there's excitement in trying new ways of doing stuff, but also it's different than what you're used to. So you're having to adjust for that. So I think it's exciting, but also in a way scary. But I think that is okay.
Exciting and scary. Yeah. Jeremy.
I think like our convictions will have to be stronger because what I see is like there's just an amalgamation of like concepts and a mashing together as like all this data comes out. It feels not very specific to our users, our brand, our expression. And you're presented with just this buffet of just things to choose from. And so we're gonna have to be really good at spotting like what really ties back to our convictions as a company and what we're delivering on and for who, rather than all of this like combination of all these different things that that it presents as what you think it should be. Like we'll have to be really good. Um, not I'm trying to think of like the term, not anthropology or whatever, but like we're gonna have to be really good at spotting some of those things and having a good anchor.
That just prompted another question, like you just saying that, how do we keep the user front and center in AI prototyping, right? Like, how do we ensure that? It seems, even just asking, I'm like, well, we do what we normally do as designers, but again, what if someone else is prototyping and adding to the design? So, Caitlin, I see in the chat, you're talking about planning becoming more important than ever, right?
Yeah, so it's like to keep to keep the user like front and center is like you invest more of that time that you have not creating pixel perfect prototypes in customer value proposition design, so that everybody who's making independent decisions using AI all is working off of the same value proposition, so that everybody has that. But it's like I think it's right now it's like everybody in the world of Agile has like sort of absented like true strategic planning, that they're like, well, we can execute so fast, like it's okay, like we can just test it, that's fine. And it's like that's not now how NVIDIA does it. They plan 10 to 15 years out. Apple, they plan 20 years out. Like that this needs to be, it's like the size of your company scales the way that the transit plan for a city does. That it's like the smaller the town, the shorter their like vision of like city plan. But it's like the bigger you are, the like bigger your plan has to be. And it's like you can't say that like, well, we can't predict the future. Because it's like fun fact, NVIDIA helped build the future because the chips that are being used right now, they came up with that vision 15 years ago and like made the right decisions and planned through there. So it's like if you have the appropriate plans for like people to go off of, then everybody has the autonomy to make the right small independent decisions in service of both the company and the customer.
Yeah, well said. All right, so we're becoming, Torian's in the chat, design's becoming business strategists, or strategic planners. We're blurring our skills so we can do more things beyond, maybe we got to design to, or we got to code, some of us already code, so then we got to become strategists.
We
So
can
much
be just
movement.
common sense people. Yeah, just like
Okay.
our job title is just like common sense specialists.
And there we are. This is a great
We
way to
just
end.
coined a new term.
Thank you all. This has been a great discussion. Thanks for exploring this, and we'll see you next time. Cheers. Bye.